harsh, right? The people closest to the deceased are put in charge. It's like, we know you're in a very vulnerable state, but time to host a party.
It's the invoice you never want to have to pay.
It's a grudge purchase and also a grief purchase, isn't it? Because it's a purchase you don't want to make because it's your loved one that you're spending the money on.
Kia ora, I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, the cost of death is in the spotlight, specifically how much we pay for funerals.
You don't need a funeral director. Most people don't understand that. You don't have to embalm. You can put someone in the back of the station wagon.
That's Fergus Whelan, who fronts advocacy group Death Without Debt, talking to RNZ. He's been doing a travelling roadshow encouraging DIY funerals, and thanks to DWD's work, Parliament's health committees looked at cremation, burial and funeral costs. Its report recommends the government's end-of-life website make it easier to find information on DIY funerals and encourages the Health Ministry to make all documents relating to cremation available on the Death Documents website. It also says the current regulations impose high costs on the public and are a barrier for those who want to organise their own funerals. But it stops short of setting changes in motion. The Funeral Directors Association says a review on updating the laws around burials and cremations has been going on for too long, and the deadline for making changes keeps getting pushed out. Here's Chief Executive Gillian Boyes.
Look, we would love to see that review completed. There's some bits in the regulations that are just problematic now. So things like the disposal methods. I was at the opening of the water cremation facility in Christchurch on Friday. Now, that's not actually a regulated disposal method because they haven't updated the regulations yet. So we'd really like to see that piece of work concluded. They're doing some work right now on these cremation exemptions, and that will tidy that up to an extent. But it is really frustrating that it's sat there for, the best part of 15 years and hasn't been completed.
Whelan insists he's not trying to attack the work done by funeral directors.
We're not anti the funeral industry. Funeral directors are nice to have.
Funeral directors feel that he is.
My members get frustrated sometimes when people say, oh gosh, the funeral directors are just ripping you off.
And people who aren't happy with high costs are taking matters into their own hands. In Rotorua, there's even a coffin club.
We'd heard about the coffin club and we went from potentially spending $2,000 to $600. And the biggest thing was we got to decorate it.
Gillian admits death could be done better, and her association, which covers about 3/4 of the funeral directors in New Zealand, has some suggestions. We'll get into that a bit down the track, but first, what does a funeral director do?
The first job really is for the funeral director to say, do you want to engage me as your funeral director? And once that's established, they'll work with the family to come and pick up the person who's died. They'll have a conversation with the family fairly quickly afterwards to sit down and go, well, how would you like us to care for them? And what sort of arrangements would you want? And if you're working with a member firm such as ours, at that point there would be some price disclosure so people understand what costs they're up for, because obviously there are costs involved, and it's really important that families know that and also can let their funeral director know if they've got some budgetary constraints.
So they've already had one big shock. I guess at that stage it's pretty important that people don't get another big shock.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's quite challenging because often, our members will get calls. People are incredibly distressed, as you can imagine. They don't want to have a conversation right off the bat about money. But as soon as possible afterwards, the funeral director does need to sit down and go through with them, what is required, what help they need, and then cost that up for them, because there's no set cost for a funeral. It is very much, depends on what the person wants and needs.
And you said as soon as, so you're not a 9 to 5 outfit.
No, that's right. And so some of the costs involved in a funeral are the professional services fee that basically means that the funeral director can offer all the basic services. That's a 24-hour 7-day-a-week service. And it continues after the funeral as well. Often, families come in for some time afterwards, to pick up ashes, to talk to the funeral director, about their grief. So it is quite a long process often, and all of that is sort of covered and costed within that basic professional services fee that the funeral director has.
So is it always, like for each funeral director, is it always the same fee, or do they work out kind of an hourly rate?
So they're private businesses. They each set their own fees. Their fees will be determined by things like, what part of the country they're in. In some places it's more expensive to run a funeral home. The buildings, the purchase of things just cost more. So it will vary, between different funeral homes. But that basic fee will be somewhere in the region of $3,000 to $6,000, depending on where you're at and what type of funeral you end up having.
Okay, so then the funeral director deals with the body, so that means keeping it at their accommodation if the family doesn't want it at home, or moving it to the home. What goes on there? Yeah,
so there's a mix of things that happen. A lot of Māori families in particular would like the body to go back to the marae or to their home, and in that case the funeral director will typically embalm the body, which sanitises it and protects it for a long period, so the family can do all the visitation they want to.
Embalming is very popular here, but it's not actually a legal requirement. If you do want to keep a body around after death, you just have to keep it cold enough. These cooling plates, which are slowly being imported into New Zealand, will do the trick. The actual legal requirements are relatively simple, just some paperwork. But everything else, casket or shroud, hearse or family car, is up to you.
Other people prefer to have the body just at the funeral home, and the funeral directors, they really take special care of the deceased, so they really treat them very well. They'll have, a very respectful area where they keep the person. If they haven't been embalmed, that would typically involve refrigeration. But yeah, a lot of care is taken to make sure that person is really treated with huge dignity and respect.
And what about choosing a coffin? Because I've seen figures of as little as $350, but that seems to be quite low.
Yeah, that would be quite low. Some people today are building their own coffins.
I just collected up a whole heap of pallets and went down and built a casket for Mum. Wow. My sister lined it very nicely. She does sewing and stuff.
Our members support that where they can. There are requirements about the coffin, particularly if you've been cremated. It has to be sturdy enough to work and have a flat surface, so it will go into the cremator or be able to be handled easily. But typically the ones that you would get through a funeral home would be somewhere in the region of $1,100 right through to $8,000, $9,000, $10,000. You can go to town with a coffin, but yeah, it really reflects what the person wanted. So there's some lovely stories about people who always liked wood, and you can get a native wood casket, a solid wood, or there's a beautiful felt one that you can get if you really like, well, that's something my husband looked at and went, wow, that's really cool, I want one of those. So yeah, huge variety, and it really reflects the person, and a lot of people try and personalise that final resting place, I guess, for their loved one by choosing something that really reflects their personality.
Okay, let's talk about some other costs, and I've got a bill from a funeral director here to read you out some of the costs to see what you can tell me about them. Disbursements and other charges. So there's cremation fees. Now, who charges the cremation fee?
So there's about 16, I believe, local councils who run their own crematoria. So you might be in an area where it's a council fee, or you might be in an area where the funeral director has their own cremator. But basically, that cost is the cost to put the body through the cremator. So that sort of cost might be somewhere in the region $600 to $1,100, $1,200, depending on what part of the country you're in.
Here's Fergus Whelan again from Death Without Debt.
As we go around district to district, it's different everywhere. So the system you have to get through, the hoops you have to jump through, are different, say, in Hawke's Bay than they are in Auckland. And the only exception to the general picture is at the moment is Whakatane, which is a great little town, and it's completely DIY friendly.
And then there's the chapel fee, which I guess that would be optional. If you didn't want to use the chapel, you wouldn't have to.
Yeah, and that's the same with all of these fees. So you sit down with your funeral director and you decide what it is you want to do. We're seeing some people just want to have a cremation with their family present, close family, and then the family decides to go and do some sort of ceremony themselves at their home or at their local club. But a chapel fee is a very sort of convenient way to do it. It suits a lot of people because the facilities are all there. If you want to do things like have a live stream of the service for friends and family who can't make it, usually the chapels are fully equipped with that sort of technology. There's catering facilities and that sort of thing. So it can come down to sometimes, what's the easiest to arrange for the family, but funeral directors will work to choose a venue that really works for what the family needs.
And then there's $965 for body care on this bill. What is it, and why is it not part of the services rendered fee?
In some funeral homes, you will see that body care part of that general services rendered. But what we are tending to do now, or what most funeral directors are doing, is separating that cost off so that they can have a conversation with the family about what sort of body care they want.
$40 for a copy of the death certificate. I guess that's pretty standard with any kind of certificate that you get.
Yeah, so that's a straight disbursement cost. That's a fee that the Department of Internal Affairs charge, and the funeral director just passes that on to the family. And the reason they're called disbursements is because it's convenient for the family just to receive one invoice. I mean, imagine if you were, getting an invoice from DIA, an invoice from the casket maker, an invoice from the council.
Yeah.
So it's it's a very helpful service for the funeral director just to put it all on the one invoice. But what that means is the funeral director is paying those costs on your behalf. So that's why they like to get you to pay the bill quite quickly, because otherwise they're out of pocket.
Right. Now, I've left the medical referee charge for last. It's $58 because this became quite a bone of contention with death without debt, didn't it, at the select committee. First of all, tell me how the medical referee situation works.
Yeah, so in New Zealand, if you just decide to have a cremation, you need to get a medical referee to look at the certificate, the medical certificate, to confirm that the person has died and that the cause of death has been accurately captured. And that's a protection for families, because if they didn't have that step, worst case scenario, someone could get away with a murder, perhaps, or something like that. So that step doesn't happen in the case of a burial, because if there is a question mark about the death later on, a person can be disinterred and could be looked at then. But in the case of a cremation, obviously, you don't exist anymore. So it's a protection step, and it's an independent step. So I think some people think that funeral directors are maybe doing this work themselves. The medical referee is an independent person. The cremation authority, so the person running the cremator, has to get the certificate from the medical referee. The funeral director can't ring them up and go, "Oi, I need this one signed off as fast as you can," because the medical referee has to be independent and not be harassed by the family or the funeral director. So that's why it's a very sort of separate role, and it's not like there's a list of medical referees anywhere, because the Ministry of Health doesn't want them being harassed by people.
And that's a real issue.
Well, it could be if it was. Obviously, people are wanting to get the affairs sorted as quickly as possible. Sometimes it does take time to go through those processes. So there is often a desire, I guess, to get it done quickly. So that's why it is kept very separate, so that people can't influence that timeline.
What does that medical referee do when they get the request? Did they go and kind of have a look at the circumstances and talk to the police or something? Or?
Yeah, they're looking at the medical paperwork that the medical practitioner has signed off. So often, doctors will just write down something very quickly. They might have their own sort of doctor's shorthand. The medical referee will say, well, what does that really mean? And they'll assure themselves that it is a legitimate cause of death, that is a natural cause. So it's a check on what the doctors are doing. And I guess if you think the doctor's shouldn't need that cheque. I can tell you the number of times a member has said to me, oh God, we've had to ring the doctor and get them to correct the paperwork because they've not used the right terminology, or they've put something that they shouldn't have put. So, doctors, they deal with life and caring for people, not so much death. So mistakes can be made, and that medical referee cheque is a really good protection for people.
And does it need it even if the person, say, dies in a hospital or has subject to an inquest?
Yeah, it's needed every time there's a cremation.
So that altogether can add up to quite easily in the vicinity of 7,000 to 10,000, and that's pretty basic.
A survey this year found 47% of Kiwis can't access $5,000 in an emergency without going into debt. That's half the cost of an average funeral.
So what help is there available? I mean, if you're poor, if you're just scraping to get by, and then your partner dies, what do people do?
Yeah. So look, if you're very poor, there is a working income funeral grant, which pays up to $2,600. So it just pays a portion of the costs. Some families will rely on that. There are some other things available, such as there is an ACC grant. Now that one's significantly more generous. That's nearly $8,000. And we've raised that disparity with government in the past because it seems to be terribly unfair that if you die poor, you get treated a lot worse than if you die in an accident. We've looked at the breakdown of figures. It's very clear it's disproportionately Māori and Pacific families who rely on the grant, and obviously older people because you tend to be older when you die. But yeah, a lot of people living in poverty in New Zealand, we know that. So this grant seems really mean, and it doesn't enable them to have all the things that you need for healthy grieving, which is something that the funeral gives you.
And then with ACC, you get kind of someone to hold your hand through the process, I gather.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's, someone will call, they'll walk you through it. With WINS, you have to fill out a very long form. You have to go down to the WINS office. You have to have a recent bank statement. Now, you might not be able to get that if you haven't got any authority over the person's affairs. If something goes wrong, you're ringing up a help centre that may or may not have the details. You might have to go through your story multiple times. It's really, really mean, and we would love to see improvements. We've been working with the Ministry of Social Development on some help, so now funeral directors can inquire on behalf of the family. But look, there's a long way to go to make that a better process for grieving families.
The bureaucracy involved when someone dies can be pretty terrible to negotiate. Dealing with insurance companies, cancelling utility bills and bank accounts, passports and driver's licences, the endless requests to produce a death certificate and proof you're the executor of the will or you have that person's permission to act. The good news is, these days you can do all this once.
There's a marvellous service called MyTrove, where you go to the MyTrove website, you just enter the details, and then they will communicate with banks, insurers, government departments on your behalf. So that can save you absolutely hours and hours of time. So that's something that our members tell families about. There's some very good sort of administrative support. But yeah, look, as a country, we probably don't talk about death enough or about grief.
The problem is the community have lost know-how in the setup. So funerals commonly used to be done by churches around marae, and as things commercialised, we've kind of lost all the skills we need to do it. To make matters worse, to try and get back to sort of affordable funerals, the institutions, councils, Ministry of Health, Department of Internal Affairs, WINS, they're making it difficult because they've set up all their practices around funeral directors monopolising funerals.
Some people do choose to do it themselves, but there is a lot to it. So oftentimes they'll start a process and then they'll come to a funeral director and say, look, I've got stuck on this bit of it, can you help me? The professional services we provide are incredibly valued, I think, by families who use us. We know when you're in a period of profound grief, your brain actually just doesn't function well. We have families coming in and they're sitting there and they can't even choose the colour of the flowers because their brain just is not operating. So to be able to think through all the arrangements, what am I allowed to do? Am I allowed to transport my loved one in the back of the car.
Are you?
You are, as long as it's not leaking or a health risk.
Okay.
If they've died of an infectious disease, don't do it, because at that point it's not allowed. I think if it's a planned death, as much as they can be, if you've got a strong stomach and you're quite a practical person, you could probably do a lot of the aspects yourself. And obviously in times gone past, people did take care of their deceased at home. But as a society, we've probably got out of that habit, and we do need the help from professionals now. So some people can do it, but I think suggesting that everyone can is a step too far.
Now, Death Without Debt wants all of the required forms to be available online, so you can do it yourself. But there's a lot of paperwork. There must be either a medical certificate of cause of death or a coroner's authorisation. All cemetery burials must be registered. For a cremation, there's that medical referee form we've already talked about. And all deaths must be registered with the Department of Internal Affairs. These requirements are in laws laid down 50 and 60 years ago.
One of the things that Death Without Debt talk about is the paperwork. And yes, absolutely, there is lots of paperwork. There's some quite confusing looking forms, but they are all accessible to anyone as long as you know how to step your way through them. And many people aren't very good at filling out forms. You could do that yourself already. But I guess what we've been a bit concerned about is that when you suggest to a government that if you just change the paperwork, a problem will go away, that's a very easy fix for government. Our suggestion for government is probably a harder fix, although we don't think it's terribly difficult. We think they need to finish the work they started in 2010, reviewing the Burials and Cremations Act, and just insist on price transparency for all funeral directors. That's something that our members have as part of their standards, but not all funeral directors will do that. And if you don't have price transparency, then harm can happen to people, because most people don't know what these things will cost. So if someone says, I can do a really good deal for $8,000 just to do a cremation, you might believe that's a really good deal, but it's not. We think a really simple thing they could do is increase the asset testing limit for prepaid funerals. So at the moment, if you put money aside in a recognised funeral plan, say a funeral trust, then that money, up to $10,000 of that money, is exempt from asset testing for the residential care subsidy.
So like when you go into a rest home and they look at how much money you've got, that's not counted because it's for your funeral.
Counted. Yeah.
Right.
So look, if they took that up, now that's set at $10,000 for years and years and years. Now if they, say, made that $15,000, now not everyone's going to need as much as that for a funeral, but
some people will need a lot more, like as you say, like culturally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So look, make it a more realistic amount and then link it to CPI so that it keeps going up. So that is a legislative fix. It's in regulations, and I think governments don't really like to just go and fix one thing. They like to fix multiple things. So that's the hold up there.
Yeah.
But it is a really simple thing they could do. It wouldn't cost them any money, and it would just mean that people who can afford to put money aside for themselves are putting a realistic amount so they don't then have that price shock at the end. And then we do think they need to improve that backstop support that they have, which is the WINS funeral grant. Yeah. We just think it's a really important role within society. Death care in New Zealand is privately funded, obviously. My members get frustrated sometimes when people say, oh gosh, funeral directors are just ripping you off. I mean, they have to pay their bills like any private business. They provide their services in the most compassionate way and the most affordable way for families, and they'll work with families to make it affordable for them. But at the end of the day, if they can't keep the lights on, they'll go out of business, and then there's no one there to help. So that's the challenge and the juggle that we face here.
I mean, but when you're paying $1,500, $2,000 for a wooden casket that is going to be burnt 2 days later, you can see how people will start adding that up and thinking, why? What a waste of money.
You just got to frame it differently in your mind. You can see the pride in families who pick their caskets. They want it to reflect the person. One of our members did an interesting experiment where he just priced all the caskets the same in quite a low socioeconomic group. And he said it completely transformed the conversation with people because they thought they had to come in and just get the cheapest one because that's all they could afford. And when they realised that they could afford anyone, it changed their whole dynamic, and suddenly they were having conversations about what else can we do for mum. So I totally appreciate that it feels like a waste of money when you're burning it, but it is actually that final gift you give to someone, and it can be a beautiful reflection of them and a beautiful reflection of your family.
And one more really important message to everyone. Gillian says, write a will. It makes a huge difference to those left behind. That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was produced by Sharon Brett Kelly and engineered by Phil Benge. Thanks to Gillian Boyes. Mā te wā.